All right, hello and welcome to the ninth and final round of the Alicante Open. The more astute amongst you will realize that we are not in Alicante, we are back at home in the United States, which means we have fallen quite a bit behind on these recaps. Unfortunately, the tournament immediately after this game, the Menorca Open, did not have basically any functioning Wi-Fi at all, and so we were unable to stick to our immediate reaction upload schedule. So I figured it would be simpler to just accept that there was going to be a backlog and catch up once we got home, which we're doing now. Unfortunately, once I got home, I caught a cold towards the end of the trip, so I've also been recovering from that. Still have a little bit of it, but hopefully we'll be able to get through at least the next few games. As we saw in the previous videos, the Alicante Open was a pretty rough tournament for us. We were entering this round with a pretty abysmal score of just 5.5 out of 8. On paper, that might not sound so bad, but we were playing very, very far down in every game due to a rather disastrous start. And so we were kind of fortunate to be even in the position we were, since at least the middle of the tournament had gone pretty well, where we were now playing our first and only higher rated player of the event, a Cuban Grandmaster, Dylan Berdayes. And with a win, we would actually, despite how badly the first third of the tournament went, we would actually almost even out the event and not really lose more than like a point or two of rating, if any. So I definitely was aiming. I definitely was trying to win this game. I viewed this very much as a not quite a must-win game, obviously. Like, okay, nobody's going to kill us if we don't win, but I did think this was an important game to at least try. Very, very hard, even though this was the last round of an event that was also a travel day for me. So typically speaking, these rounds you don't see a lot of fighting between people that are not playing for prizes, which we absolutely were not at this point. But I definitely felt, just for reasons of trying to salvage the tournament and the trip as a whole, that this was an important game to try to press. I wasn't sure what to expect in the opening. I did know that my opponent played a lot of the Sicilian, which I was expecting him to repeat. I knew he also played some e5, which was possible. But generally speaking, I don't expect most title players to have 100% consistent repertoires in the modern era. Almost everybody plays at least a couple of openings, and so I knew that. And nothing would really be much of a surprise that he could choose on move one. But I was expecting that if he did play a Sicilian, which he did, that we would probably get a Najdorf. Most of his games are in that. And so, we started traversing down that path pretty quickly, but I was surprised to see him instead deviate from what I assume is his main opening and instead play knight to c6, initiating the classical Sicilian. Now, obviously, you can never be 100% surprised at somebody playing the classical Sicilian nowadays. It's very, very popular at almost all levels other than the very, very top. I think I even have videos of games this year, which I haven't played that many of, so that is saying something, of me playing not only against the classical Sicilian, but also playing it myself. Pretty much every, I would say, titled player at this point has it in their repertoire at least a little bit. It's a very conceptual opening, more than having a lot of deep theory. There are some deeply theoretical lines, for sure. But basically, Black is saying, okay, I'm going to accept a passive position. Both of these bishops don't really have much scope compared to some other openings like the Dragon or the Najdorf. Often they develop very slowly to d7 and e7, and only later is Black going to try to pursue some kind of active plan of his own. But it is a very, very solid position. It's very, very difficult for White to crack. And in many ways, I like to think of the classical Sicilian as basically being a bit of a skill check opening in a way. White is going to have to solve a lot of sort of small problems along the way if he wants to get a serious advantage. And if he does solve all those problems, okay, great. He has an advantage, like, congratulations. But realistically, very, very few players below the top level are going to manage the level of precision that you need to actually beat this opening, even though it's objectively probably not one of the top tier, or maybe even like the second tier of openings. So it's a very, very popular choice, especially when you're trying to play for a win. So hard to be too surprised at seeing it. But I didn't know if this was something that my opponent played a lot of, or if this was something that he was just playing for the one game. So I decided to just stick with the main lines for at least a while and see what exactly it was that my opponent had cooked up, if anything. Bishop to g5 is by far the main line, and probably the only challenging move. White has played, bishop e3 is technically a line, bishop e2 is technically a line. Even random moves like, I don't know, h3 or a3 are probably lines as well. But bishop g5 is the only real opportunity for an advantage, so I think it's played almost exclusively. The opponent continued down the main line for a bit. This is part of the point of bishop g5 is to clear open the queen side for white to castle. White is generally going to be focusing his attention on the king side. So getting the king over to the queen side where it will be comparatively safe is almost always the plan. And certainly if white plays bishop g5, is kind of already committing to this. If white instead played like bishop e2, then okay, probably castle and king side is the follow-up. But once we enter this line, these next few moves are pretty automatic. And here is where we got our first sort of deviation of the game. Black generally almost exclusively plays the move bishop to d7 here. This defends the knight, prepares b5, develops a piece, clears the c file. There's a lot of very positive reasons to play this move. But instead, my opponent chose I would say, somewhat more unusual move order with the move bishop to e7. Typically, this follows after bishop d7. So after bishop d7, white has a choice of two moves, either f4 or f3, which lead to very, very different types of positions. But against either of them, either f4 or f3, black generally plays the move bishop to e7, intending to castle, setting up a very, very passive but very solid configuration with this sort of small center, as they call it, with the pawns on d6 and e6. So to start with bishop e7, I wasn't sure if it mattered, really. Generally when you get like these very slight deviations in the main lines, like one move is the main move, and then they play like some follow-up, but they start with the follow-up instead, like to just try to change the move order. Often when they do that, sometimes it doesn't matter at all. Sometimes it matters like a little bit, and sometimes it's like really, really bad. Like there is a very concrete reason that you needed to start with the other move. Here I was really not expecting that there was going to be something seriously wrong with bishop e7. Like I did not think that this was one of these positions where changing the move order was going to just like lose the game on the spot. But I also don't think, I didn't think at the time, and I haven't checked, but I still don't think that this is a completely innocuous transposition either. I suspect that there is probably a reason that bishop e7 is slightly inferior to bishop to d7. And in the game I was trying to speculate on why that might be. There are a few, I guess, natural reasons that we might think, or candidates, I guess, for the reason that there might be a difference. One is that because black hasn't played bishop to d7, the knight on c6 cannot be recaptured with a piece. And so one possibility is, okay, maybe we could take on c6, and forcing black to take back with the pawn is for some reason good for white. I felt that was kind of hard to believe. Taking on c6, okay, sure, like, it does make it a little bit awkward for the light square bishop to develop, because it's going to be staring at this pawn in the way for a little bit. But black has gotten a pair of pieces off, which is nice because he has less space. Black has also managed to recapture towards the center, which is generically nice. And in this position has sort of the additional concrete detail that it prepares d5. Black has also opened the b file, which could become relevant. And even though, yes, like this bishop is a little bit harder to develop, it's not really going to stay that way forever. Once black gets d5 in, which we're not really able to stop, white is probably not going to take it, which would concede the center entirely after something like, I don't know, let's say h4, d5, takes. Now black has full control of the center, and it's very difficult to believe that that's a positive transformation for white. But if white doesn't take, and plays either e5 or like bishop d3 or something, then black will eventually probably play the move d4, taking the knight, and then either play c5 to open this diagonal for the bishop, or e5 to open this diagonal for the bishop, in either case, this bishop is sort of becoming a real boy very, very quickly, and there's not a lot that white can do to interfere with this plan. So I definitely didn't think that taking on c6 was the actual problem. Another potential issue with starting with bishop to e7 is that now white takes on f6. Black can't take with the queen anymore, which would keep the bishop protecting the d6 pawn. And if black does take with the bishop, then the lack of protection on d6 is actually quite relevant. White can go ahead and take on c6, take on d6, and this is just a very, very clear pawn for white. Maybe black has like something resembling compensation after queen b6, I don't know. There are some lines where he does this, probably not here. This looks pretty bad. But for the most part, taking on f6 is going to force black to take back with the pawn. So maybe this was the explanation. Maybe, you know, black is not really ready to destroy the pawn structure just yet. But I also found this a little bit hard to believe because this is a very typical idea for black for example, after bishop d7, f4. Bishop e7, once again, white has the option of taking on f6, either now or in a move or two. And black is generally going to be taking back with the pawn regardless. So it's not like some great concession for black to have to take back, like quote-unquote have to take back on f6 with the pawn. Like, oh no, like please don't make me take back with the pawn. You know, yes, black does sort of lose a little bit of the pawn structure. It does make the king a little bit less safe if it goes to the king side. Black has a very, very strong center. Black does have the advantage of the two bishops. There's kind of enough to compensate, usually. White is probably slightly better. It's a little bit easier for white to play. But it's not really a punishment, per se. It's just kind of very, very similar to the main lines. So I thought for a little bit more in this position about, okay, what is the difference? And the explanation that I came up with, which is probably completely wrong, but what I was thinking during the game, is that maybe it's a much more subtle reason. After bishop d7, the main line, once again, if white plays f4, then after like takes, there's, you know, a lot of theory here. Black is generally doing fine. But white also has this option of f3, which is initiating the sort of typical rouser kingside pawn storm. You'd play this against like the dragon, for example. You could play it against the Nightorf. And against the classical Sicilian, it's no less strong. If white gets to play just g4, h4, h5, maybe move the bishop back, play g5, black is in serious danger of just getting completely rolled over. And the only reason, in many ways, that black is not just, you know, getting decimated out of the opening in this line is this sort of this very tactical idea that in many ways just sort of salvages the opening completely, which is that after g4, which is white's normal follow-up after f3, if white had time to play h4 and then h5, black is in deep trouble. But black has this very nice tactical idea, which is to challenge the kingside immediately with h5 before white is sort of set up to completely destroy it. And now after takes, knight takes, takes, it looks like this is black has just blundered a pawn. You know, white has collected the d6 pawn for no apparent compensation. But the tactical point is that at the end of the line here, black has this very nice idea, knight to g3, exploiting the pin along the h-file, and this endgame can only be better for black. In fact, it's probably much better for black, and very easy for black to play. So after g4, you know, in this line, white is not able to take the pawn on d6, at which point black has sort of gotten enough pieces off the board that there should be no serious danger. And once again, black can even be better because suddenly it's white's pawn structure that has been a little bit compromised. So typically instead of g4 in this position, white starts with the move h4. Again, intending to follow up with g4 maybe after h5 to prevent black from playing it himself. But now after h6, bishop e3, and h5, black has at least temporarily stymied the kingside advances, and so white needs to start to pursue alternative plans. Maybe putting the bishop back to g5, and starting to play in the center, trying to play for e5. White can also very slowly play for like bishop e2 and g4, but this is a very, very major line. There's a lot of theory involved. And so I thought, okay, maybe the difference is that after bishop e7, maybe we don't actually need to spend time playing the move f3. We can actually go ahead and start our kingside pawn storm immediately with h4. Again, intending h5 to prevent h5 from black himself, and only then following up with f3 and g4. It's a very subtle difference, but maybe that's sort of the exploitation of this move bishop e7 to the extent that there is one. I haven't checked this opening since this game, so there's a very good chance that that's all just nonsense. But at least during the game, that was the explanation I came up with. So I did play the move h4. I was expecting black to play bishop d7, and then white would need to decide, basically. Either we can go f3 and transpose back into the main lines, which is not a bad outcome, because, I mean, those are lines that I play. White can also maybe consider the immediate h5, though, which is the sort of quote-unquote difference that has been admitted by this move order. So I figured, okay, let's play h4. It can't be a bad move. We have to play h4 at some point anyway. And after they play bishop d7, then we'll figure out, okay, do I play f3 or do I play h5? But my opponent sort of slightly surprised me again with this move queen to c7, which is a bit of an odd-looking move to me, I think. Like, the queen doesn't really belong at c7 in the classical Sicilian all that often. It often would prefer to go to b6 after the move b5. This is part of the reason that black often plays bishop d7, is to free up or sort of over-defend the knight on c6 to prepare b5 and maybe queen b6. So this is sort of the opposite approach. Instead of using the bishop to defend the knight and free up the queen, black is using the queen to defend the knight and free up the bishop, which I suspected was preparing for black to play b5 and then bishop to b7, trying to find a more active square for the light square bishop. But it is a very slow move in an opening that is already sort of notorious for black's plans being a bit slow. And the queen can be a little bit misplaced here. So I wasn't quite sure how to evaluate the move, but I did think that because black has sort of invested this additional tempo into putting the queen on c7, now we shouldn't be concerned anymore about any sort of shenaniganry on the king side, and we can just go ahead and continue with the normal plan with f3, and again intending to follow up g4, h5, etc. My opponent continued to respond very quickly, which on the one hand, means that he's still in his opening knowledge and his preparations, so there's a bit of a downside there. But it also meant that, we're at least on the right track. He was expecting our moves, which means our moves probably weren't all that bad. So, of course, we were captured back. My opponent played b5, again, probably intending bishop b7. Here I played king b1. I didn't really have a great reason to play this move. It's just sort of a general improving move. After either side castles queenside in almost all openings, the king would like to go to b1 or b8 for black. It's just a much more natural square, solidifies the queen behind positioning, and so you'll see this on a lot of lines in like the dragon, in the Najdorf, in the Caro-Kann. White is often investing a tempo to play king b1 very, very early, even without any apparent specific purpose. And here I basically did that. I didn't really have any, specific reason to play king b1. I just figured that it would be a general improving move. But this might have been a mistake a little bit. It's possible that this was slightly inaccurate, because once again, white would like to be very, very fast on the king side if possible, and so it's very natural to consider the move h5. The thing that in general scared me off of h5, and we'll see this again in a couple moves, is that I was very concerned about this pawn sacrifice starting with b4. If white declines the sacrifice and plays, for example, knight e2, then we lose some critical control over the center, both on d5 and e4, and black can actually start considering some tactical possibilities with, trying to maybe like... I don't think there's anything that actually worked, but for example, black can at least calculate like moves like knight takes e4, or playing e5 and then knight takes e4. But more to the point, black can start to play this move d5, which starts to hammer back in the center, now that the knight is no longer controlling the square. And if the center sort of blows up, white can find herself in a very, very awkward position. This queen can be very, very vulnerable to harassment. The fact that we spent 2 tempi on h4 and h5 is actually quite relevant, not just because of the time spent, but we've also weakened our kingside quite a bit. Our pieces are very, very underdeveloped. And so we pretty much have to call the bluff and accept this sacrifice. But then again, black is starting to make some very, very serious headway in the center as a result. After d5, the queen is attacked. Only good square for it is to go back to d4. Once again, black can continue harassing the queen with e5. The queen, once again, probably has to go back somewhere, and after d4, okay, the knight is getting harassed again. If we go back after bishop e6, yes, white is up a pawn, but the king looks very, very uncomfortable here. There's a lot of open lines. This looks extremely dangerous for white to play. And in the meantime, there's no real counterplay on the king's side because black has such a iron sort of full control of the center. It's very unlikely that white can generate any kind of attack, and so black is not going to be scared to castle and bring both rooks into the attack. In general, I think this position is very, very scary for white to play. Now, this is a bit of a fanciful line. There's other things to consider. For example, knight d5 here is probably just good for white. But these are the sorts of vague problems with rushing with h5 that I was a little bit concerned about. And it's part of the reason that I figured, okay, let's just start with king b1. This makes b4 a lot less appealing, but it can't be a bad move. Let's just keep it simple. My opponent again actually spent a little bit of time here, which was my first indication that okay, king b1 maybe wasn't the most accurate. But my opponent castled, which makes sense. I spent some time again starting to consider the ramifications of h5. Again, b4 is the move that we're always needing to consider. So I started with g4. Again, can't be wrong. Opponent played bishop b7. And this is where, white has now made all of the sort of, let's say, quote-unquote automatic moves that he can. This is the point where we have to decide, are we playing h5 or are we not? And after quite a while, once again, because of our usual friend b4, I decided that this was still too scary to allow. Maybe this was a bit of a bluff on my opponent's part. I think I was probably overestimating the impact of this a little bit. But for really not many concrete reasons, I mean, again, I was very, very concerned about this line with e5 and d4 just taking full control of the center. And even though I didn't see any concrete, immediate follow-up for black, it's not like black is just, winning this position, I didn't like the look of it, to be honest. And that was really as far as it went. I just didn't like the look of it. Which was a bit lazy, probably. But eventually I decided to play this move, bishop to e3, which is also a very typical idea in the classical Sicilian, probably not a bad move. The idea is that the bishop has kind of served its purpose on g5. It's forced black to undergo kind of an odd operation and a very, very passive one, where these pieces are kind of misplaced. This bishop on b7, okay, it's more active than it is on d7, but it's still staring into a wall. This bishop on e7 is not contributing at all. Black is not really controlling much of the center. It's a very solid formation, but it's not one that gives him any scope. So the bishop no longer needs to be on g5, and in fact on g5 it's kind of in the way, because white would like to put a pawn on g5, and eventually g6. For example, white's immediate plan is to play h5, g5, g6, try to blow up in the king's side and just deliver checkmate. It's a very simple caveman plan, but it's very, very effective. So I figured, okay, bishop e3, once again, probably can't be that bad. My opponent played a move that I really wasn't expecting, rook f to d8, which is also kind of an unusual idea in the classical Sicilian. As far as I know, maybe it's more common than I thought, but I thought it looked a bit odd. The idea, of course, is very transparent. Black just wants to play the move d5. It was, of course, legal to play the move d5 immediately. This should be noted. But I spent some time here, and this is where not doing this immediately after the game is going to be a bit of a downside, because there were lines here that I was calculating quite heavily. I don't know how much I'm going to remember them. I think the main thing I was looking at was e5, trying to kick away the knight. d7 is by far the most natural square, putting pressure on e5. Now white can't really play f4. because now suddenly this bishop is quite good. After bishop c5, the queen has to go somewhere, and then there are immediate tactics with d4, but even if there weren't, even sacrificing this pawn for nothing would be a very reasonable thing for black to do. But I thought that the move, I think, this is what I was thinking, I thought that the move bishop f4 was maybe just, like, fine. It looks a bit odd, you know, especially since we just moved it back to e3, but I thought that playing against this bishop made enough sense that even at the loss of a lot of time, it was probably fine. I'm not 100% sure that's what I was thinking about. There's also g5 to consider, of course, just trying to undermine d5. It basically forces e5, and then this sort of very typical operation for black, giving away this pawn, but taking back in a way that preserves the fork, which I wasn't sure how to evaluate. I think looking at it now, still don't know how to evaluate it, honestly. I mean, I guess, like, yeah, it's a little bit hard to say. But both taking and then 92, or immediate 92, taking back here, look interesting. I think white should not be mad at this. It's definitely still a game, but black is probably fine somehow here. I'd be surprised if white has, like, a serious advantage. But in any case, my opponent decided that d5 required more preparation, and it makes sense. I mean, it's definitely starting to make this queen feel a little uncomfortable. d5 will now, well, we're not going to play that. d5 will now come with quite a bit more force if it's allowed. I spent a lot of time here, and eventually played the move g5. Very sort of automatic move in a way, but I mean, you can see I spent like 10 minutes here. Obviously, this wasn't the exact move I was thinking of. I was trying to think about the follow-up. The point is that we're not immediately doing anything, per se, but this knight has to go somewhere now. If it goes back, then we've definitely achieved the kingside plan we want. For example, knight d7. Now h5 and g6 is coming with very, very powerful effect. The black king is under very, very serious fire. And so, you know, sort of the reason that white wouldn't play g5, and the reason that white usually starts with h5 before g5, is if we start with g5, then black has this square available for the knight, which is also a little bit passive. You know, knight on the rim is dim, all that sort of stuff. But it is threatening knight g3. It does interfere with the kingside pawn storm. It's generally a good temporary placement for the knight, and it's not going to be stuck here forever. Black can always play g6 and knight g7 to reactivate it into the game. But I had done this, obviously, with a specific idea in mind. I didn't just play g5 for fun, which was to play this, I thought, very powerful move, bishop to h3. Just, first of all, getting out of the way of knight g3, so it won't be traded off. This also starts to prepare bishop g4, which would kick this knight quite heavily. For example, if black just plays like rook c8, then after bishop g4, the knight is kind of trapped. Black has to just defend it with g6, and after takes, the kingside pawn structure is completely decimated, and the king is very, very weak as a result. White would probably play here, maybe just sliding back. The general plan will be to just go after this pawn with like knight e2, knight g3, knight h5, maybe to f4 and h5 if there's no e5 issues. We do have to defend this pawn first, so we'd probably play like, I don't know, maybe rook c1, maybe rook d2, maybe queen d3 or queen d2. But in general, white should be, I thought white should be very happy with this, even though I'm sure objectively it's probably not like winning or anything. So this means that black does need to do something immediately, and if, you know, the natural way to do something immediately is to take advantage of this preparatory move and go ahead and play d5, which is what my opponent played. But the other point of bishop to e3, which we're now revealing, is that we can sort of get this queen off of the very, very scary d file in a very natural and aggressive way by playing the move queen to b6. Which is really not that easy for black to actually handle. Black probably isn't thrilled about trading queens here. If we go takes, for example, this rook doesn't have a lot of good squares. This is the other point of the move bishop h3, is that suddenly we're actually controlling a very, very important square here. If black goes ahead and puts the rook on c8, then after we take on d5, there's sort of out of nowhere this very, very important pin, and we just win the d5 pawn for nothing. If black tries to go to d7, which would also be a very, very natural square, there's the same problem with this pin. And if black goes to like d6, then there's like tactical issues where the rook is going to be drawn away, and again this d5 pawn is just lost. So the rook would have to go to a very, very awkward square, like maybe back to f8, or to b8, I guess, is probably the only like tactical way, because again this pawn is under serious fire. But after like, I don't know, there's a lot of ways for white to reasonably continue here. The simplest is probably just to play takes and like come back to d4 or something when this isolated pawn is a very, very serious weakness. Black's pieces are very, very awkward, and white should have a very, very heavy advantage here. Honestly, practically, this is probably just winning. So my opponent spent quite a bit of time here. There was a pretty cool line here that I'm going to have to try to remember. This is another downside of not doing this immediately after the game. I think it is actually in this line with rook b8. So now if we take on d5, again, if black is taken back, then bishop d4, what is an overwhelming advantage. So the only real way for black to try to keep fighting is this move b4. Now if white has to move the knight away, black is very, very comfortably taking with the bishop and should have no problems. So we do need to find something more concrete, which I thought would be this move d6. And now there was a cool line. I'm trying to remember. I think it went something like takes. Yeah, I guess this was it. Takes on f3. This is basically black's only try. It always is just down material for quite a bit. Bishop to d8, interfering with the supportive black's defense of the e8 square. So now we're threatening to just promote, actually with checkmate, which would be kind of cool. Black can go ahead and take, but now there's no follow-up. Black doesn't have time to play like bishop d5, for example, and attack a2, because again we're threatening to promote with check and mate. So the only real way to defend this pawn is bishop c6. And now suddenly this bishop once again becomes very relevant, and we can play this nice move bishop g2, deflecting the bishop away from the promotion square. And it's also effectively a skewer. If the bishop moves back, we are just picking up a rook and the game, even though we've allowed taking the check and our king looks very, very airy. So that's one justification. Not like a super necessary line, but another reason that trading the queens is a little bit awkward for black. I was expecting to move queen b8, which I think actually could lead to a very similar type of line. After queen b8, for example, takes, d4, d6. Let's say, for example, take on f. Well, I guess you can't take on f3. Okay, maybe this is an even simpler version where we're just getting to d8 kind of immediately. I don't remember exactly the line, but in any case, my opponent sort of, as I was expecting, did not go ahead and trade the queens or slide back, both of which would look very, very awkward. And instead played this move bishop to d6, just trying to defend the queen. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. This is really why I wish I did this immediately after the game, because there were definitely a bunch of other cool lines with this pawn unstoppably promoting. But anyway, let's move on. We'll come back to it. We'll come back to it later. My opponent played bishop d6, and now after takes on d5, went ahead with the idea of b4. And here I spotted what I thought was a very, very nice idea. This is a very, very, very long forcing line. I spent a lot of time here. Once again, this is probably the critical moment of the game. So once again, if the knight moves, black is just going to take on d5 with the bishop, and black is not going to be any worse. Probably white's not really worse either, but black is doing quite comfortably. So white needs to find something immediate if he wants to have any real advantage. And so what I had foreseen when I took on d5 is that we can actually go ahead and sacrifice a piece, starting to blow open black's position by taking on e6. Black is forced to accept the sacrifice. There's no choice, otherwise black is just down several pawns for no compensation. So my opponent went ahead and took on c3. And now the idea was a very simple move, just taking on f7. Nothing particularly fancy. Black cannot take back with the queen because the bishop would hang. So black is forced to do something else, either take back with the king or move the bishop somewhere. Or sorry, not the bishop, move the king somewhere. But neither king move is particularly appealing, because if black plays king f8, for example, this would be egregiously bad. Now we can just once again take on d6 with a tactical point in mind. Black has to take back with the queen, and now because the king is sort of very unfortunately placed on f8, we can play the move bishop c5, picking up the queen in the game. Similarly, if black goes to h8, now this pawn is very, very powerful. We can go ahead and just make a queen, for example. There's probably even more powerful, slower approaches as well, but this is the simplest. We can just make a queen. Black cannot take with the bishop because the queen will hang, and if black takes with the rook, then we just pick up the piece back, and white is comfortably up at least a pawn, probably more. Probably even like taking and playing bishop c5 is even stronger, or even trading and playing bishop c5 is even more convincing. So taking back with the king, basically forced, and now white has a choice, which is a very, very important choice that decides the game. One is to slide the queen back and give check, forcing the king to move somewhere. Let's say, for example, king f8. And now that the queen has moved out of the way, the b6 square becomes available for the bishop, and we can go ahead and collect an exchange. But remember, we are already down a piece, so after, for example, queen c6 takes, black now has two pieces for a rook and two pawns, which on paper is a pretty fair exchange, especially in an open position like this one. But black's king is very, very weak, which is much more important. And the pieces are a little bit awkward in the immediate short term. The d-file is a problem for black. This knight is not participating. This bishop is just kind of staring at its own queen. And so white is actually... I wasn't sure how to evaluate this position. I thought that white was probably better, but I wasn't sure how much. In reality, I think white is actually just winning here. This is very, very close to white just like forcing resignation, honestly. And the critical move that I missed here was this very nice idea, bishop f5, which both threatens bishop e4, picking up the piece, but also threatens to take this pawn on h7, which is not usually a pawn that you can just go, gallivanting with your bishop and spending like several moves to go grab. Oftentimes, even if you take on h7, it's a completely poisoned pawn and your bishop gets trapped. But in this case, there is not only no good reason that white cannot take this pawn, getting the bishop to h7 is also has a side benefit of protecting the g8 square for the queen to invade. And I think at this point, black really just has no good defense, to be honest. I'm sure there's some way to struggle on that the computer will find, but from a practical perspective, I think this basically would have won the game on the spot. Unfortunately, I did not play this, and I played the second option, which also looks very, very appealing, which is the much more direct move of just taking on d6, picking up some material back. Once again, black is forced to take with the queen. There's no choice here. This allows white to take the bishop, so now we picked up both bishops, both the b7 and d6 bishops for one rook, which is very, very good. The material count right now is about even. White has a bishop and two pawns for a rook, which again, on paper, is about equal. But this knight is completely out of play, and these two bishops are very, very, very powerful. So, even by itself, I think the material imbalance probably favors white a little bit. But I also thought that concretely I was picking up a third pawn, which would probably just win the game, because... if, for example, queen e7 or something, then after takes, Let's say like bishop g4. Knight is again a little bit trapped. If knight g3, then rook e1 and bishop f2 will completely trap it. So, you know, Black probably has to play like g6. And then, among other things, we can even just take this pawn. Yes, it's a double pawn, but it has a very, very straight shot down the board that's very difficult for Black to actually deal with. Because we're controlling the c8 square, we're also controlling a lot of squares along the way. White is probably just winning. There's also other things, other problems with queen e7, for example. Once again, we have queen b3. We could take the pawn with the queen. We could also just ignore this pawn and play for an attack. So my opponent instead went for king g8, which I thought was basically forced. And this was my main point, was that we can now pick up a third pawn with queen b3, king h8, queen takes c3. There's no problem on the back rank because white is very comfortably defending with bishop to c1. And once again, we have a very straight shot with the c-pawn. So here I felt very, very comfortable, and I thought that there was still quite a bit of technical work to do, but white should be objectively winning. What I missed was the line continues here. This much I saw. Black can now try to activate the knight, starting to take advantage of some of the back rank issues. After knight g3, the only square for the rook is e1. We can't go to either g1 or c1 because of a fork on e2. So rook e1 is forced. And now black has this very nice move, knight e2. This much I had foreseen. Of course, we cannot take because after queen d1, yes, it's not mate, but this is a fork of the king and the rook. And now, because black is controlling the c1 square, black is threatening queen d1, so we can't play a simple move like queen to c4. This means that queen d3 is forced to interfere with the d-file. And now after takes, this is the thing that I missed, was that here I thought that with the knight under attack, black has to just go somewhere with it, like knight d4 or something. And then white is very, very comfortably probably winning quite easily with 3 pawns for the exchange, and the position kind of plays itself. We could even take. I don't think we have to, but we could even take, and I don't know. Well, okay, actually we probably shouldn't take because the pawn is hanging. But we can just play a very, very simple move like bishop g4. And with 2 very, very powerful bishops and 3 pawns for the exchange, this should be pretty straightforward. But what I miss is that black can just take this pawn. With a very, very clear tactical point. If we take on e2 now, then black has rook e8, and because of the pin on the e-file, white is having to give the full piece back, and is definitely not winning anymore. So I was very, very upset at this point at missing this move, which is a very, really simple move, to be honest. This is not difficult. And sort of continues the theme of the whole tournament of just missing like really obvious resources from my opponent in not very complicated lines. I mean, from this position, like taking on d3 is not a very complicated move. The whole line is forced. Taking on d6, there's no choice along the way for either side. Both sides, like everything is forced. This position is basically equivalent, and so not even considering rook takes d3 is really quite bad. Basically, I would say just completely unacceptable for anyone even close to this level. So I was very upset with myself. And so I was trying to find a way to preserve any winning chances at all, because at this point it's pretty clear, I think, that black is out of danger with only 2 pawns for the exchange and having to give away one of the bishops. It's very, very hard to believe that black can be any worse. And I played a really bad move here. I think objectively it's fine, but practically speaking, it's really overcooking. Which was, instead of taking on e2, but basically there's 2 choices. You know, we can take on e2, allow rook e8, and play like, for example, bishop f5, take, bishop e4, and try to run the b pawn. It's an option for sure, and one that I definitely should have gone for in hindsight. But I didn't think that this was really winning at all, because the king is really not that far away. Black can just start walking the king over, and white is not really in time to make a very, very serious pass pawn here. Like, you know, if we just go down the very, very direct approach, black's king is getting to the defense of this pawn very, very, very quickly. And in the meantime, the rook is going to slide over, pick up some of the kingside pawns, and most likely this is just a very, very simple draw for black. Not hard to hold at all. So I was trying to be a little bit too fancy and played this kind of odd-looking move, bishop to f2. Point, of course, is that we're trying to preserve both bishops. We're still attacking the knight, and black probably can't take on f3 because we have bishop g2, skewering the rooks. So in theory, black should have to move the knight. And if black plays, for example, knight f4, then after bishop g4, we've at least preserved both bishops on the board, which is a very, very serious accomplishment. We definitely do not want to trade one of the bishops for one of the knights, or black's only knight. In this position, okay, black once again still should not be in any real danger, but there's at least the inklings of an idea starting to form. You know, we will play bishop g3, kick away this knight, and control the b8 square to start trying to launch the b pawn down the board. We are going to be able to start activating the king. The fact that we have two bishops does make it a little bit harder for black to just YOLO his king out into the open, where it can actually start to become vulnerable. We can generate like some kind of mating nets, or at least ways to keep the king out of the center. Maybe some tactics with like discovered attacks on the rooks are going to be relevant and stuff like that. So that's what I was hoping for. And the other point is that if black plays rook e8, which is what my opponent played, then once again my plan was to just play bishop g4 regardless, and intending to follow up with f4 on the next move. The point would be, for example, if rook to d2, f4, let's say, for example, a5, then we can kind of free up our construction by, among other things, we can consider just trading, planting the bishop on e5, and then because we're controlling b8, at least launching the b pawn down the board starts to become a little bit more viable in a way that we also can preserve some chances on the king side, because this bishop will be able to support our king side formation. So there's some world where, for example, you know, the king gets very, very stuck trying to defend the b pawn, and we're able to walk our king to the king side. It's a very fanciful idea, but that was the point. Once again, I missed a very obvious resource, which is that in our planned line, after bishop g4, rook d2, if we do go for f4, then yes, if black passes, like with g6 or something, we can go ahead and play our idea. But black can actually just abandon the defense of the knight entirely with a very simple move, rook to b8, and white is basically just lost. We have no good way of defending this pawn. The only thing we would be able to think about is b3, but then the knight is entering the game with very, very powerful effect, exposing a discovered attack not only on the bishop, but even if it wasn't attacking the bishop, picking up this pawn would be more than good enough. So here the only, defense would be, or quote-unquote defense would be, this very odd-looking move, bishop to a7, trying to at least keep the rook out of b8, but then there's other problems with a discovered attack on the rook. I think the computer actually, so when I was glancing briefly afterwards, said that this is actually okay for white as well, because knight c3 is not immediately dangerous after king c1. We can trade, white is perfectly happy to trade rooks. And then once again, white can follow up with f4 and taking on e2, but it's not a serious winning attempt. Black is certainly not going to lose this position. But I missed this idea with bishop a7, or I saw the move bishop a7, but I missed that knight c3 was not a serious problem. And so I instead, at this point, just tried to abort course and play bishop f1, which I think is also fine. This is connected with an idea. Black is forced to take on f3. Well, okay, maybe not forced. I guess maybe rook to d2 is also playable, but then once again, we can take on e2 twice, play bishop d4, solidify the pawn structure, and we get the position we're quote-unquote hoping for. But taking on f3 is just a free pawn, so there's no reason not to do it. And after rook takes e2, now black has the option of entering this endgame, where now we at least have two pass pawns that are running down the board, which is quite important. But the more powerful option is this fancy move that I expected and my opponent found, which is to start with this move rook f8, putting pressure on both bishops down the board. At this point, it's very clear that one of the bishops is going to fall. There's no sense in trying to defend it. So we start with the move b4, just trying to get our queenside pawns rolling. This also fixes the pawn on a6 so that we will at least be able to pick that up along the way. And after takes on a6, my opponent started running the king over to the queenside, and at this point I realized that actually I had gotten myself into a little bit of trouble here, because sort of in the pursuit of trying to maintain winning chances by getting this connected pass pawn formation, Black is not really that concerned with it. You know, these connected pass pawns are going to be very easily handled by the Black king, coming all the way over to the queen side. And in the meantime, this configuration on the king side is not really holdable by the bishop anymore. The king is also completely cut off because the rook is very powerfully placed on the second rank. And so it's actually white that needs to be kind of careful to hold this. Somehow it's really not that easy. And I actually started to get a little concerned at this point that I might even lose the game, because the move, like, at some point I knew at some point soon there was going to be a critical move that white had to find, and I wasn't sure exactly what setup we were aiming for. There's going to be some kind of fortress, and I'm not very familiar with these sorts of positions. So I started with bishop d3. This is partially aimed at getting out of the way of the pawn. It's also aimed at being able to play b5 without blocking in our own bishop, but it also targets the king side a little bit by focusing on the h7 pawn. And my opponent played g6 to deal with that second part. And then started with b5. The queenside pawns need to get rolling. It's our only source of counterplay. And if we play a4, then rook f4 is very inconvenient. So b5 is basically forced. My opponent continued to bring the king in. We push our pawn as far as we can go. Might as well bring it all the way to b7, no reason not to. And after rook f8, this is the critical moment by far now of the endgame, at least. I spent most of my remaining time here and immediately blundered. I think, well, so I mean, one very important point is that these pawns are forever stuck. Like, even if we get the a pawn all the way to a6, black is going to be able to plant the king on c7 and just chill. So the only way that white can sort of hope to not lose the position at this point is to distract the rook just long enough that we can get the king over to the king side. But it's not that easy to do that. For example, if we play king c2, king d6, king d2, if we could get to e3, black, we're obviously not in any trouble because we've controlled the very important f4 square, and white can even think about, like, somehow trying to win again. But unfortunately, we're kind of like just a little bit, we're kind of one move off. After king c7, we can't afford to give away the b pawn, and after bishop e4, now the rook is coming to f4. Black has freed up the rook by defending the b8 square with his king, and now after giving away this pawn, it might even still be fine. This is the sort of thing where I wasn't quite sure. It's kind of nice that we have this configuration on the king side, because now after like a4, for example, black cannot actually just go for this pawn endgame, which typically he would be able to. Like, if the pawn were back on g7, it might be more possible. But since we're holding the king side with just our own pawn, black doesn't have time to go for this sort of thing. So this might be technically holding, I'm not sure, but it's definitely unpleasant. And so I went for what I thought was a very concrete way of ending the game, which was this move h5, which I think in hindsight was probably a blunder. Of course, the critical thing to calculate is whether black can take on h5. And the reason that he wouldn't be able to, in theory, is that, okay, now we can take on h7, and we have a second pass pawn running down the board in the g-pawn, which is very relevant. Black can play, for example, h4, trying to run his pawns down the board. But we have a very important move here, what I thought was a very important move, and the reason that I went for h5, which is this very nice move, bishop f5, intending, first of all, to stop the black's advance of the pawn, which is very relevant. Now black is not able to just, black is not able to win the game by trying to race the pawns. He actually does need to stop ours. But we're also threatening bishop c8, at which point we'd have interfering with the sort of defense along the 8th rank. And at that point, we would basically be forcing black to play rook b8 here, bishop c8, and black is never going to be in time to advance his king over here because the g-pawn is going to be running in the meantime. We're probably not able to run the g-pawn ourselves because it will just get captured by the king, but this configuration makes it so that we're actually able to just run our king back over to the king's side, which means that black basically has to force this exchange of pawns, at which point white cannot lose. The absolute worst case here is that we reach king and bishop versus king and rook, which is a very, very easy draw. But what I had missed here, and what fortunately my opponent overlooked as well, is that black does not actually need to start racing with h4 so quickly. He can actually just also bring his king into the defense over here, over to the queen side. And now if we continue with bishop f5, this is much less dangerous. Black can just play king c7. The bishop is now threatened for real. And if we go for bishop c8 again, then black is just picking up the pawn with the rook with a very, very clear win down the board by just using the rook to support the h-pawn. So we can't do that, but what I was intending was to use the fact that the king is all the way deflected to the queen side to just continue with the move g6. And what probably is what both of us missed here, it looks very, very scary with this pawn running down the board, but black is actually able to, or I guess actually probably with actually, I don't quite remember what the issue here was. Well, actually, okay, I guess here there's actually an issue with rook b8. Yeah, this is the problem. Because the king is very, very unfortunately placed on b1 specifically, after rook b8, black is just going to pick up this b-pawn. We can't defend it with bishop e4 anymore. And we're not able to play g7 because with this specific position of the king, black is forking the king in the second pawn. So we're not actually able to play g6 immediately. We have to start with like king c2. And now after king c7, g6, because black is holding the b-pawn with the king, he is actually able to reintroduce the rook into the defense by giving a check wherever this king was. And after the king moves, let's say like d3 or something, then black can hold this pawn from behind, and once again the h-pawn is a straight shot to victory. So I'm not sure, well, I kind of missed like both of these parts, to be honest. It didn't really occur to me that black could actually justify this plan of running the king to the queen side. I'm not sure what it was that my opponent missed, whether it was rook b8 or rook f2 to g2. Both of those were surprising ideas to me when I glanced at it with the computer after the game. But fortunately, I guess he called the bluff, or didn't call the bluff, as it were. And after h5, instead acquiesced to a draw with rook to b8. After taking on g6, once again, white basically cannot lose because, yes, technically speaking, black is up material, but the absolute worst case is king and bishop against king and rook, which I can hold. And it probably isn't even going to get that. We can just play a4, put the bishop on d5, and like black isn't even going to win the second pawn, let alone we're not even going to need to prove our king rook king bishop technique. So we ended the tournament on a draw, which is, I think, probably a fair result for how badly this game was played. I was definitely winning at several points. We can... I do want to check, like, maybe a couple of things here. So... yeah, so this is one critical moment. We talked about this a little bit, where I was saying, black probably doesn't want to trade queens and have to put his rook on a very, very awkward square. It turns out, as the computer pointed out afterwards, that this is actually barely okay for black. Rook b8, which is the main move I considered, is bad because of this idea with bishop c7 that I was talking about, where we force the rook to an even worse square on c8 with this pin coming. But the computer very, very calmly says, okay, black can just play rook e8. And even though this is a terrible square for the rook, the center is resolving enough that it doesn't actually matter. After takes b4, there's no longer any of these d6 ideas because the rook on e8 is defending the bishop on e7. And so after knight e4, bishop d5, black once again is doing just fine. So bishop d6 is actually a very, very serious mistake because of specifically the line that we were talking about. But it is required for white to find queen b3 here. to have not just a winning advantage, but any advantage at all. Everything else is just equal. Once again, because of this entire force line. And then I did want to check the endgame briefly because, yeah, the computer actually said rook d2 is better, but I didn't really understand why. I guess it's claiming that this endgame is actually quite bad for white, which I did appreciate during the game. So taking on f3, I guess technically is a bit of a mistake. But I'm trying to see where it was exactly that was the problem. Okay, I guess it is exactly h5 that is the issue. So I guess as we talked about, king c2. Yeah, so this is one of the positions we were talking about. It turns out that this is actually okay for white after just king f3, something simple. Keeping this rook at bay so that this pawn is defended. And it turns out black cannot actually really break this configuration. White is just fine. So h5 was a bit of a panicked move, or I guess a bluff, as it were. So, but those are the two critical moments of the game. Both sides had an opportunity to win. Me with queen b3 back in this position. Queen b3 I think is a very, very clear win. Really quite simple. Not happy about missing that, but my opponent also had the opportunity to win later on in the endgame after this pretty egregious h5 blunder, so a draw is kind of a fair result. With the draw, that means we finished on a score of 6 out of 9. It was not a good performance at all, but far from the worst event that we've had either. So especially after the start of the tournament, I definitely wasn't all that upset. I think we ended up losing like 5 rating, but that was almost entirely attributable to the game that we lost in round 3 with the white pieces, which, you know, in theory shouldn't happen very, very often. So I was looking forward to the next tournament. Even though this one was bad, I did feel like this one was kind of a warm-up anyway. I was much more focused on the Menorca Open, which was a stronger event and a little bit more, I guess, professional. Not that there was anything wrong with this tournament, just Menorca is obviously a very, very well-respected tournament. So I was definitely looking forward to that, and basically immediately after finishing this game, I had to go travel to it, so not a lot of time to try to rest and recover. Which turned out to be a very, very interesting event for a lot of reasons, which will be a little bit of a spoiler. We will get into those in the next set of recaps over the next couple of days. But as I said at the beginning of this, I will also be trying to produce a bit of a more digestible, episodic, vlog-style video about this tournament as a whole that goes over not all 9 games in detail. Obviously, that's what these last 9 videos were for, but some of the critical moments and just sort of thoughts on the tournament as a whole. So for more, I guess, yapping content, take a look out for that. Hopefully that'll be out in the next week or so, maybe longer depending on how long editing takes, but somewhere in that vicinity. And in any case, I will see you either for that or for the next set of recaps of the Menorca Open, which will be coming up shortly. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.